Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, chaos in Gaza resulting in scores of deaths, stampedes surrounding humanitarian deliveries, and in a separate event, IDF soldiers firing in self-defense after multiple warnings. Plus, analysis about the war from former Ambassador Michael Oren and Professor Gil Troy. And encouraging Israelis through art. Murals across Israel celebrating the courage of Israeli and Iranian women. All this and more on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. In an early morning stampede on February 29th around aid trucks in northern Gaza, more than 100 Palestinians died. Paul Strand has more on that and the latest news.
The White House labeled the deadly incident caught on camera by Israeli military drones tremendously alarming and called for an investigation. It appears most who died were crushed by a crowd rushing the trucks, or were run down as those trucks, driven by Gazans, began to flee the mob scene. In a separate incident, a few Gazans were apparently shot as a large crowd charged toward Israeli soldiers nearby. A U.S. aid official immediately criticized Israel.
Desperate civilians trying to feed their starving families should not be shot at.
But an Israeli military spokesman talked of Gazans being killed by their own neighbors, not the IDF.
Thousands of Gazans dispensed upon the trucks. Some began violently pushing and even trampling other Gazans to death, looting the humanitarian supplies.
Hagari says in the midst of much chaos, shots fired by IDF soldiers were only meant to disperse an angry mob and were never aimed at stopping the aid reaching Gazans.
No IDF strike was conducted towards the aid convoy.
The American Jewish Committee Global Voice reported of the more than 100 killed, fewer than 10 were shot. Reports continue to say Hamas is hijacking much of the aid. Meanwhile, ever more hungry, desperate Gazans are still camping out along aid routes. This man saying, quote, "I can't wait till my child dies from famine." In Beirut, Lebanon, an angry mob demanded more aid be allowed to reach Gazans, blaming Egypt for holding up more than 2,000 aid trucks near the Rafah crossing. This protester said, quote, "We will not allow Gaza to starve. We will not allow further genocide to occur." In the latest terrorist attack in Israel, a 57-year-old rabbi and a 16-year-old hitchhiker were shot dead in Samaria Thursday by a Palestinian Authority policeman turned terrorist.
He shot two of our residents where they were here in the gas station. One of our residents came from a hummus shop right here and killed the terrorist.
Amid all this, the Israeli military is carrying out its mission against Hamas, reporting that it's now killed 13,000 terrorists in the war in Gaza. Meanwhile, it appears talks to free hostages held in Gaza remain stalled. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel will free them one way or another.
Thanks to the combination of military pressure and tough negotiations, we succeeded in returning alive 112 of our hostages. We're determined to return them all. With or without an outline, we will fight until total victory.
Paul Strand, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Some questions on everyone's mind right now are what happens with Gaza after the war and how will it be governed? Former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Michael Oren joined CBN President Gordon Robertson to discuss this and more.
Well, let's talk about the post-war plan. Netanyahu is calling for Israeli military presence and then a buffer zone on the border. Is there any foreseeable future where Gaza is back under Palestinian control?
I think that's the ultimate goal, is to find a Palestinian leadership that is responsible, that is more committed to the future of their children and grandchildren they are to killing our children and grandchildren. And that may take a while. Keep in mind that Hamas has been ruling the Gaza Strip for a long time. It was raised an entire generation of Israelis, of Palestinians, excuse me, who have learned literally before they walk that the most sacred thing they can do is slit the throat of a Jew. And you have to just simply watch their television, look at their summer camps, look at Palestinian Sesame Street and see how they teach young kids to murder and butcher and behead people. And that's going to have to be undone. That can't be undone, just by an executive order. It means changing the entire sort of DNA of Gaza. So we have to find that type of leadership. Until that time, I see really no alternative but to an extensive Israeli security control over Gaza. There can be international involvement in reconstructing Gaza, an international involvement, maybe an inter-Arab involvement in the reconstruction of Gaza, but security control and a buffer zone. And I know the Biden administration said there can be no buffer zone. I think Israel's going to have to dig in its heels here. The United States is not about to give up the buffer zone between North Korea and South Korea. We have to ensure that no terrorists can ever get close to that border again. And the buffer zone we're talking about, which is really several hundred meters, is very, very, I think, a reasonable demand.
Well, can Israel even trust the international community here? I mean, you look at the history of UNRWA. I've been saying for years it should be defunded and it shouldn't exist anymore. But now we have revelation that they actually employed terrorists, members of Hamas. Their employees participated in the October 7th attack. I hear you that there should be international governance here for Gaza, but can you even trust it?
Well, I say governments, not security control. Security control has to remain in the hands of Israel for that precise reason. You can't trust them. And by the way, UNRWA absolutely must be dismantled, not only because it harbored terrorists and used its schools as arsenals, but only because UNRWA is the only organization in the world that perpetuates a refugee issue. I mean, you are a refugee, a Palestinian refugee, even though your great-great-grandfather was a refugee, even though you have citizenship in another country. And by the way, keep in mind, the so-called refugees in Gaza, so-called refugees in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, are by their own definition living in Palestine. So I don't even understand why they're refugees. That has to be dismantled, and a different school system has to be put in place, one that indeed teaches Palestinian children for peace and not for war. No one talks about a Palestinian state. No one talks about a democratic Palestinian state, because people know what that democracy in the West Bank would yield.
Well, let's take this hypothetical further. If there is a Palestinian state and it's, this so-called two-state solution, isn't it going to be just as radical as what we're seeing right now? Isn't it going to be dedicated to the destruction of Israel?
Well, if the leaders of that state have come through the Palestinian education system, that is, I think that's not questionable. And a mass majority of Israelis today understand this. I mean, even people who are left of center understand that a Palestinian state comes into being today, tomorrow, the day after, it's going to be a Hamas state. I live in Jaffa, in South Tel Aviv, along the coast, but I look out of my rear window in my apartment, and I see the Hebron Hills. If a Palestinian state is in those hills, we will not be within rocket range. We'll be within rifle range. They can put a bullet through my rear window. And, no Israeli is going to agree to that. We frankly think it's insane.
Well, are we back into the same situation Israel's been in time and time again, where you can win the battle, but not win the peace?
Well, I think that since 1948, we've pursued a tactic, which is also our strategy. And we're in an incredibly hostile environment. And every once in a while, we have to remind our enemies that it's not a very good idea to make war against us. And some of those enemies will eventually reach the conclusion that war is not the way to go. This happened with Egypt. Egypt tried to wage not one, but 4 wars of national destruction against us. And finally, the Egyptian government concluded that this wasn't a good way to proceed. The Jordanians waged 2 wars of national destructions against us, and they concluded it was a good way it was not a good way to proceed. And that was the case with the signatories of the Abraham Accord countries as well. And this is our fate. This is our destiny in the Holy Land, in the land of Israel, where occasionally we're going to have to fight to be a free people in our homeland. And in between those battles, we will continue to develop what is, by any international standards, one of the most successful nation states in the world. And we will secure our borders, sometimes at a terrible price, but we will secure them. And we will go on to be successful and a homeland for the Jewish people everywhere.
Coming up, one Israeli historian making no apologies for Israel's current war of self-defense. In the messaging put out to the world by Hamas, Israel is characterized as the aggressor in Gaza. A correspondent, Paul Strand, spoke with an historian and professor who presents a very different view. Take a look.
We're speaking with Gil Troy, a Jerusalem Post commentator who recently wrote this column, No Apologies. Israel is acting in self-defense. Gil, people from all over the world are, charging Israel as just waging this war horribly and killing innocent Palestinians. But I take it from that column, the last thing you think Israel should do is apologize.
I have a problem. I'm an American historian. I know that Abraham Lincoln didn't apologize during the Civil War. I know that Franklin Roosevelt didn't apologize during World War II. I've also read Just War Theory, which says that when you have a supreme emergency, you have to respond. On October 7th, while there was a ceasefire, which had been pushed on Israel by the international community, Hamas attacked in the most brutal, despicable way, killing over 1,200 innocents. And Israel had no choice but to respond. And when you come to assess the morality of war, and we know that looking for morality in war is kind of like looking for vegans at a cannibals convention. But fundamentally, when you talk about morality of war, you say, is it just or is it not? And then, when we actually see how disciplined Israel has been, and every innocent life shouldn't be killed, it's terrible. But when Israel's been so disciplined, and basically they've killed one civilian for every one terrorist, that's an extraordinarily low ratio. The United States ratio tends to be 4 and 5 to 1, especially in urban warfare. Traditional urban warfare is 10 to 1. And so every death is a tragedy, but I'm actually very proud and I will not apologize.
America's President and Secretary of State have said things like Israel's acted over the top in Gaza and is dehumanizing Palestinians. What do you say to America, who would talk to Israel at a time like this, especially when Israel was the victim here? They were the ones who were invaded and attacked and had 1,200 people killed. What do you say to America?
So first, let's go back to President Biden's initial words. Don't. He said to the rest of the world, he said to Hezbollah, he said to Hamas, essentially, don't do this, and to Iran, don't get involved. So we have to go back to that. The only way to do don't without it being just talk is, unfortunately, to use guns and rifles and tanks. And so my appeal to the American people is simply judge Israel as we judge ourselves. Judge America as Barack Obama acted in Mosul and in Iraq against ISIS. Judge America as it responded after 9/11. Judge America by the standards of democratic standards, and we'll see that Israel is defending not just itself, but defending Western civilization and defending the United States of America.
You quoted in your commentary the famous writer Amos Oz, who is no warmonger. I think he was considered a peacenik. Why did you quote him, and what did he say?
Amos Oz was one of the most famous Israeli leftists. From the time the 1967 war was over, he said, let's give back the territories, let's work with the Palestinians, let's find a peaceful solution. And in 2014, when Israel was once again faced by waves of rockets from Hamas. And let's remember that Israel withdrew completely from Gaza in 2005. And yet Hamas took over in 2007, and the rockets and the terror increased. And in 2014, Amos Oz is being interviewed with a very important reporter like I am being today. And he said, before you ask me a question, I want to ask you a question. What would you do? What would you do if your neighbor came, took his kid or your kid and hid behind the kid and then started shooting? How would you fight? He said, we have no choice. What would you do? And that's my appeal to America. What would you do? How do we defend ourselves against people who hide behind hospitals? I call them Hamas-spitals. They hide in mosques. Let's call them Hamasks. They call them kindergartens. Let's call them killer gardens. They use every civilian infrastructure to hide behind, and then they target our civilians. So we're really against an enemy which is very diabolical, that has no problem hiding behind their own people. So I echo Amos Oz's the famous peace question. What would you do? You want to criticize Israel, fine. Just give a constructive alternative.
Amen. All right. Well, thank you so much. Gil Troy, Jerusalem Post commentator, author of the recent column, No Apologies. I'm Paul Strand, CBN News.
Up next, inspiration from Israeli and Iranian women heroes and celebrating them through art. Iran's current government may be an enemy of Israel, but historically there's a strong connection between the two countries. I interviewed an Iranian-American filmmaker whose mission it is to show support for oppressed Iranian women and Israel through murals. Human, great to see you back here in the studio. We've talked about your murals for many months. The latest one is really one of the most you're excited about, and we have it here back in the monitor. Tell us about it.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. Yeah, this next mural, it's in Tel Aviv, and every time I do a mural, I get a little bit more bold. So what the first one was, you know, 4 women who were just united by their hair because they were all killed for showing their hair. Mm-hmm. In this one here, the 9th mural, what you have is not only 5 distinct pictures, you have a story. You have the story of God's plan for Iran. So this mural, as I said, is in Tel Aviv, starts off with Jeremiah 49:38, where God says, I will set my throne in Elam and destroy her kings and officials. Every time I tell somebody Elam is Iran, they don't believe me. Elam, the place where Cyrus the Great was born, the place where Queen Esther is buried, and the place where Daniel the prophet lived. Elam. This is Elam. So that's how the mural starts. Next to the map of Iran and Elam is Queen Esther. Okay? The whole book of Esther, because no preacher ever says this from the pulpit, takes place in Elam. It takes place in Iran. The whole book does. And above Queen Esther is Esther 4:14, which every preacher boils down to, you were chosen for such a time as this. Arguably the most famous verse within that book. Next to Queen Esther is a woman named Kosar. And Kosar won the silver medal in archery for Iran. But she protested along with the women. And as a result of protesting the Islamic regime, they have these little guns with pellets and they shot out one of her eyes. So I have her riding a lion with a bow and arrow in her hand. Strength, a true woman warrior. And above her is Hosea 11:10. And Hosea 11:10 basically says, when the lion roars, my children will come back trembling from the west. It's a call. It's a call. God saying to the Jews, return to the land. Next to Kosar is Sherel Haim-Pur. Sherel Haim-Pur is a Persian Jewish soldier who was killed by Hamas on October 7th. And it was her very last weekend as being an IDF soldier. And she decided to grab her gun and go into the battle. Hamas killed her, burned her body, made her unrecognizable. And so I put her in because she too is a strong female warrior. And then the last symbol is basically 2 hands. One hand is the flag of Jerusalem. The other hand is the Shah's flag, the flag with the lion holding a sword with the sun rising in his back, forming a heart. And above that, I put Jeremiah 49:39, which is basically God saying, I'm going to reestablish the fortunes of Elam. I'm going to destroy her kings and officials in 38. I'm going to reestablish her fortunes in 39. Because there are many goals with these murals. I want to inspire the people of Iran to keep fighting for their freedom. But really, I hope and pray that Iran and Israel will be friends again today as they have been for 3,000 years.
I don't think a lot of people understand that and know that there has been a historic ancient connection between the Persian people and the Jews.
Yeah, that's exactly right. All the Persian Jews are from 500 BC. They're all from the time of Esther. When you talk to a lot of scholars about Judaism, they'll say the Persian Jews are the purest Jews, and they've kept and maintained their tradition for so long. And today, to this day, in Iran right now, there's still 15,000 Iranian Persian Jews in Iran.
Well, yeah. Well, kol hakavod, Human. Amazing mural, and what a story and a message.
Yes.
For such a time as this.
Thank you.
If you want to be part of this, to help Human realize his vision of putting 18 murals across Israel, go to human.tv. You can read about him, his plan to support Iranians and Israelis with the murals, and find out how you can help. Still ahead, digging out from the rubble of war, how CBN partners are helping kids and families get back to normal.
All
All Israeli families have been hit hard by the war. Soon after October 7th, some working parents found themselves unable to go to their jobs because daycares were shut down. CBN Israel made the difference for one kindergarten that needed help before it could reopen.
The Home Front Command said that kindergartens could reopen only if we had bomb shelters. Putting 2 bomb shelters in each daycare is a cost of hundreds of thousands of shekels. If I had waited until I had the right protection for the daycare, I don't think I'd be able to reopen.
We are providing bomb shelters, and we have an opportunity here to actually help more than 100 families to be back to their normal lives, because the rockets that are flying from Gaza from like 60, 70, 80 kilometers are heavier and stronger than the ones that are going to the Gaza envelope, which is like 7 to 10 kilometers. So it's a whole different construction, much more expensive, and we had to make it custom made. Have a certain thickness of the walls, the ceiling has to have the filter, the AC, the electricity, the internet, all the requirements from the Home Front Command. They have to all be in the standard, right? All the bomb shelters.
As a mother of a soldier in Gaza, I needed this daycare. This was my comfort. This is what made me get out of bed in the morning and leave the house. Because in the mental state I was in, I just wanted to monitor the news all day. But I knew that there were many parents and staff that needed me. I started to think, what can I do? How can I return to the daycare with this big need? Because in the end, it's our home, and the children are used to it. When Ali said that there was something that she could do, I felt that for the first time in a long time, I was really able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I was able to smile finally, even though my son was still in Gaza. This made me believe that at least something, a significant part of my life, would be resolved.
Parents want to feel safe and want to know their kids are safe. The emotional burden of sirens and the war and the fear and everything, praise God and thanks CBN Israel for thinking about the kids here and the families here, and it's so important. I mean, I'm one of those parents. I could not come back to work until we had bomb shelters.
At first, they delivered 2 amazing bomb shelters. The children were happy. They were able to return to their daycare where they are comfortable and things are familiar. This is also protection for the neighbors, because there are many houses here that do not have shelters. Kids and parents were so excited and grateful. They were really happy because the shelters made it possible for them to go back to work. Because some parents hadn't been able to work full-time. I feel so safe now. I'm not afraid. I know that if something happens, my staff is taken care of. I also know that the parents are not stressed out. It gives me great confidence to know that I can open the daycare in the morning and everyone is protected here, both the kids and my staff.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on social media and access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And please continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and all of Israel, the safety of IDF soldiers and everyone caught in harm's way, and for the return of all the remaining hostages. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.